Hi, everybody. If you would, please have your cameras on and welcome to all of our guests, as well as the folks in the conducting class itself. It is my great pleasure to welcome Edwin Outwarter, I've been following him just because we have so many students who've played in the San Francisco Youth Orchestra that comes to us, to Cornell, and they've always talked so positively about their experience with the SF Youth Symphony. He's now the main conductor for the San Francisco Conservatory, and he has been the resident conductor of the San Francisco Symphony. He was involved with the U2 Symphony. He was the music director of the Kirchner-Waterloo Symphony for a decade. And so he has done so many innovative things with orchestra that I wanted our students to get to meet him and get to know him. So welcome.
Thanks, Chris. And I met Chris. I bet you helped me put spread the word about an online conducting class this summer, which I really appreciate. So
absolutely.
Very happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm happy to help anytime there's a great initiative like that. So one of the things I noticed that you were at Harvard as an English literature major.
Yeah.
And you were involved with Bach, and you wrote music for the Hasty Puddings, and you had an a cappella group, Harvard Din. And so I'm just curious, how does a Harvard English literature major make your way into the conducting profession?
Well, I was a pretty avid classical musician, a bass player in high school, and I grew up in Los Angeles. And LA is kind of a funny city, like for young musicians, because the orchestras are a bit older. So there was no San Francisco Youth Symphony. There was no really great high school youth orchestra. There's some smaller ones. So I was very lucky as a bass player to play in some of these orchestras, but they were more like 25, 30-year-old, students or young musicians that I got to play with when I was 16. And we did crazy things like my youth orchestra conductor was Zubin Mehta's father, Meili Mehta. And for his 80th birthday, he did all the Strauss tone poems. And I played, so I was a senior in high school, I played all the Strauss tone poems on bass, and it was great. So I had these kind of amazing experiences. At Harvard, the orchestra wasn't quite at the level that I was used to, actually. So I played a lot of chamber music, but I kind of had the conducting bug, and what Harvard was very good at was giving opportunities for conductors. And the Bach Society was a student conducted orchestra that's been conducted by John Adams and Alan Gilbert and various other people. And I won the audition. So with some other youth orchestra conductors, had kind of tried a few things. And so that was my first way in, to that. And then going to Harvard, I went because I was just thrilled to get in. It wasn't something anyone in my family had done really. And I figured, if I were a good enough musician, I would be able to do this, to go to a liberal arts college. And if I'm not, I have a good hedge, in a certain sense. I mean, I was really practical about it at that age. And I said, music is hard, the chances are hard, it's luck, it's hard work, it's talent, it's all that. And if it works out, great. And if it doesn't, I'll be in a good position. I really thought about that. And I'm glad I did. And at Harvard, and I'm sure it's the case at Cornell and other places similar, there's a core group of really serious musicians, some of whom go into the profession, and for us, maybe about, in my class, maybe 5 or 6 people that I know who are doing great work. Actually, 3 conductors, at least. Me, Scott Yu, who has a show on PBS right now.
Yeah, he's got a great series, traveling through all the musical sites. The one I saw was on the town that make the Granary violin.
Yeah. Sarah Hicks, who does a lot of pop stuff all over, live to film and pop stuff, and is doing really interesting work in Minnesota Orchestra. Mm-hmm. And Evan Christ, who's quite active in Europe. So at least four off the top of my head who really became conductors from my class alone. So it was kind of a funny, funny thing.
If I could just kind of zone into that idea about conservatory training versus liberal arts training, and then possibility for sort of a music profession, because I think some of our most serious Cornell musicians are actually in our conducting class, because they're students who are not just taking part in orchestra, but then they want a little deeper level of engagement. So, but then for various reasons, I think students are, it's hard for them to imagine a switch into a professional career into music from a place like Cornell or Harvard, where the main focus isn't really on music, right?
Yeah.
If they are engaged in music, their engagement tends to be really about, well, I have my study thing, my academic thing, but then the thing I love is this music thing. So I think
Mhm.
they lead this sort of dual life, not really thinking that this music portion of their life could lead to a professional musician's career. Uh,
Um,
so
Good
what
point.
advice would you have for these very
You
serious?
know, you only have so many hours in a day, and I love music more than anything, but I was told in high school that the music major at Harvard was not really great for undergraduates, and it wasn't a great department, and some older brothers of friends of mine had bad experiences, quite frankly.
Hmm.
So my uh, kind of agenda coming in was to avoid being a music major, and to kind of design my own curriculum in a weird way. So I kind of made my own path there, and it was a bit unusual actually. I did English because I love literature, and it was a good counterpoint to. I wasn't a sciencey person, but some people are, which also were like Scott. You was a physics major and did hardcore, you know, stuff. And but for me, it was liberal. It was more in the humanities and lit, which, as I'll explain later, turned out to be very helpful. But I decided to take a non-honors, so I didn't write a thesis because I was practicing and doing so much music. Like I made that decision pretty clearly.
Hmm.
So I took kind of a light course load so I could spend time practicing and doing music. And then I found a professor. I handpicked the music courses that I wanted to take,
Hmm.
because I already kind of, you know, I didn't want to take the courses I didn't want or didn't think I needed. And that's presumptuous, perhaps, of a young 18-year-old, but I think I was right actually in retrospect. Um, and I think I found that my first year harmony class was my favorite class. It was Bach chorales, Boulanger, kind of the stuff that you guys maybe are learning in your class, as Chris said. And I love the professor. There was a great tradition of that training at Harvard at that time.
Hmm.
And once I took that class, the professor's name was John Stewart. I did independent studies with him for 4 years. Like
Wow.
he was really happy to work with me. I spent a summer studying with him,
Hmm.
um, and practicing piano and doing all this stuff that I needed to do. So I kind of designed my own
Hmm.
kind of. I had essentially a private, you know, teacher. Not so much about conducting,
Right.
like technique, but about score. I'm going to turn off my do not disturb. Uh, my score analysis, like basically analysis and understanding the language of music,
Right.
which I think is essential to conducting because you're not playing the notes, you're not practicing the notes. Your hours should be spent on having some sort of understanding and insight into the music, um, and not, you know, and that's where I spent my time. In other
Mhm.
words, sorry, all my phones and
It's
computers are
okay.
going off. I turned. So that was I was again it was like a very firm idea of what I thought I needed, and that continued into grad school. And when I felt like I didn't understand like Tristan Isolde, I found someone to teach it to me. And
Mhm.
I what I was always very aware of what I didn't know, and I was
Mhm.
always on the lookout for learning what I didn't know. Knowing where my gaps were as a musician.
Yeah, I think that aspect of knowing yourself enough to know what you don't know, and having enough confidence that this is the path you need to take. I think and in a way, take learning as your own initiative is an idea that we could our students could really take whatever their field is, right? Because I think so many times, especially if they're in a very rigorous sort of engineering program, then their courses are kind of laid out for them, right?
Yeah,
It's
that's
not,
different. Yeah.
yeah. So it's sort of a educational model where the faculty and the university decides, well, we know what's good for you, so here is the path, and you don't really have any variation or choice to wander around towards your final goal. But and I think that's in some ways the downfall of a uh, prescribed education in a university setting where you end up just jumping through hoops. rather than
Yeah.
really trying to figure out, okay, what are the things that I really need to learn? What are the things that I'm not good at? And how can I design so that my curriculum, my path is really helping me learn. So I hope our students really learn from that, because that applies to whatever your field is. So so let,
And there were moments where I had to make a choice, like in English, I was in a great seminar, loved the professor. He's like, do you want to, you should write a thesis and let's follow this path. I was like,
mm,
uh, I think it's music for me, but thank you. And,
yeah,
uh, but yeah, and when I see students now, it's the ones who kind of think outside the box that I have the most hope for. And I think they may, because I think a career in music is all about that, like figuring it out.
so then I'm going to kind of flip your role just quickly, because now that you're in the role of guiding students at the conservatory in San Francisco,
Hmm.
and just as you said, students who think outside the box, um, how do you advise students to kind of go through this conservatory training, this environment, to have a wider perspective of the world in terms of not just musical skills that they need to gather, but all the skills they need to have to gather as artists, to be
Hmm.
able to say something with their musical technical skills?
I do, I'm brand new, but I do have some really strong ideas about that. I definitely give them the kind of opportunity to talk to me in kind of free form. I think the way I program shows that I'm thinking about things differently. And for instance, this first concert, I'm in the middle of a rehearsal cycle for our first concert. We're making a film out of it called What We Do on the Stage, and it focuses on an empty stage and like we're on pause. And when we come back, what do we want the world to look like?
Mhm.
Considering COVID and social political upheaval and Black Lives Matter and like lots of things that are really changing things. Like,
Yeah.
and so I'm giving the students opportunities to be in the film, to make their voices heard. It's like a lot of interviews with students, to do some John Cage, Paulina Oliveros pieces, which are kind of stretches for them. One of them is even editing and assistant directing the film, and just came up to me, and she herself had made these beautiful films in high school.
Mm.
So you kind of put out the call at
Yeah.
first
Yeah.
and see who comes. And I'm so far impressed with the amount of students who are involved. We have maybe, maybe there are about 40 people in this particular cycle, and maybe 10 or 12 of them are
Mm.
involved in extra musical aspects of the film. And so that's having that be the first kind of plunge bodes well for the culture that I want to create.
Yeah.
And some students will come up to me and like, I want to learn more about conducting. Yes, you can. I will help you. Or I want to, put this, programming crazy program together. Yes, I'll help you.
Mhm.
And so hopefully the rumors will spread, and it will almost become like, the thing you need to do,
Right.
to make it work
Right.
in this, environment, to make it, and you see the success of the students who really think this way. I think it's essential in the 21st century to it's not the old path. You have to be creative. You have to come up with new stuff.
Mhm.
And I would say, even if you get an orchestra job, and everything works out perfectly in the old school way, almost always the people who are happiest in these jobs are the ones who are doing things creatively and not just sitting there and waiting, for the next piece to come up.
So
Those orchestra musicians become unhappy often.
yeah. So, in fact, I want to kind of do a deep dive into your 10 years at Kirshner Waterloo as a music director from 2007 to 2017, where you've done so much innovative things that I want our students to kind of know about. But also, our students have an assignment that they're working on, where they're designing an imaginary Ithaca Symphony Orchestra. So they have an option to create a 4-concert, actually 6-concert season, 4 regular concerts, and 1 pops, 1 young person's concert, pre-pandemic. So, sort of a
Yeah, yeah.
normal time programming. And then, or they have the option to do a post-pandemic, where they have to come up with an idea of how to get through this time of social distancing and where you can't really have a large orchestra. So that is their challenge to them. And so just to let the students know, during your time at Kirchner-Waterloo, you had a series called Intersection. So I would love
Yeah.
for you to talk about that. And also you had a hack an orchestra a challenge to young people where their task was to hack the orchestra's programming. So I would love for you to talk about those two things.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, Intersections was another series. I had found a lot of I was very frustrated in the business with people saying, "Is it classical or is it pops?" You know, and often it was neither,
Right.
and often both classical and pops were extremely boring in a certain sense, in the way, not the music itself, but the way in which it was presented. And so, to me, the most interesting artists were kind of in betweeners, personally, and like, I don't know if you know, like Time for Three or something like that. They're all, incredible Curtis trained musicians who can play, but play other genres or can jump around. Um, and so I was trying to find a home for these people who didn't live in either arbitrary camp.
Mhm.
Uh, and then that, but the series quickly evolved into something else.
Hmm.
It evolved into a interdisciplinary collaborative series. So we would still have composers come in. So at first it was like having Nico Muhly come in, or having Gabriella Lena Frank come in. And these are all, or having Richard Reed Perry, from Arcade Fire, who also composes, or Bryce Dessner, these guys who are kind of living in these different worlds. But then as people got into the series, the audience, I started being approached to do other collaborations. And so it became more like music and food. I did a whole concert about food with a restaurant, where we served courses in between, and was live, and really chose like Babette's Feast and like the specific thing for that movie. And then we did the most kind of famous one, which is pretty easy to find online, is Waterloo is one of the great, Waterloo is one of the great engineering schools
Hmm.
in North America, actually, kind of MIT level. And there was I started working with these people who were music fans, called the Institute for Quantum Computing.
Hmm.
And so they're building a quantum computer. They also had a theoretical physics institute called the Perimeter Institute that was very prominent in town. And Stephen Hawking would go there and things like that. And so we did a whole program about music and physics, which was the biggest stretch, of all, and yet was actually the most interesting of all the ones I did, because we started tracking the timeline of classical physics and classical music about the time when Einstein discovered spooky action at a distance. And I think there was someone, I forget who, said there's nothing new to be discovered in physics, like Lord Kelvin or something like that classical physics was happening. That was about the time of the breakdown of, tonal harmony with Schoenberg and Weber, and like this entire moment in history where various languages of science and music were breaking down almost at the same time. Why? We don't know, but the timelines were eerily similar. So we talked about ideas like, every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and antecedent consequent phrases in Mozart and Haydn and things like that. These kind of languages that we kind of our perception of the world, which kind of come out in science and in music. But when quantum phenomenon, the double slit experiment, all these things started happening, it upended everything. And in music, you have people like Cage and Xenakis, and who are really dealing with randomness and trying to harness and make something out of randomness in a very similar way to what some of these physicists were doing, to kind of start to grapple with randomness as something we need to believe in and not try to avoid. So it was a really good, it became kind of a radio documentary. It was done live. We toured it to several orchestras. And it was super cool. And for me, I just changed my whole perception of a lot of things, just sitting down with these really brilliant physicists. And I'm not a science person. I'm not, I love reading about science and, the good kind of layman's books about science. But there were interesting moments where I would be sitting with a table of physicists and saying, does this feel quantum to you? Like, what is it? Because quantum physics is impossible to explain. I mean,
Hmm.
it's, you know, and so it's more about a vibe or a feel. And music is, in a way, the best thing to kind of describe that rather than words, because it's, you know, it gives you kind of a feeling of it. And I think what I learned is a lot of these physicists do things by feel as much as by, you know, intellect. So that was a big successful project. The other one that was interesting was with neuroscience. I co-wrote a show with Dan Levitin, who wrote "This Is Your Brain on Music,"
Hmm.
called "Beethoven in Your Brain." He had come more from a rock background with his music, and I said, "Hey, you want to try something with classical?" And we talked about kind of the brain as a pattern detector and how we neurologically perceive music, you know, from an instinctive level, and how our brain is always finding patterns, and how we can, when we hear a larger and longer piece,
Hmm.
you know, for the first time, like a Beethoven symphony that unfolds over, you know, how we stay engaged with it, and how, even if we don't know about music, um, our brain is detecting these patterns anyway, you
Hmm.
know. And we found that, you know, one of the greatest impediments to, for people who want to get into classical music, I don't understand it, I don't know it. And what turned out to be really inspiring about this concert with Dan is that we proved to people that you do understand it. Your brain is figuring it out, even if you don't know how to articulate it. And we had live polling. We had a poll where people remembered the key of the piece like 10 minutes later. So we went through the first movement, second movement, A flat major, back to C minor. And then we played the beginning of the third movement in three different keys, um, you know, 10, 15 minutes later.
Hmm.
And, and I would say 95% remembered what C minor sounded like, which was
Wow.
fascinating. Yeah.
Wow.
Um, and just by clicking on the poll. And so lots of things we haven't discovered yet, I'm noticing about music and how we interact with it. And it was fun. So,
I
and finally, Hack the Orchestra was, again, a tech, how do you make an orchestra relevant? This was very much a tech community.
hmm.
Um, and so we said, well, what can you know, coders do to make our experience in orchestra better? And we did a hackathon. So they had, you know, 48 hours with the orchestra. They had a couple 2.5 hour services where they could ask or have the orchestra play whatever they wanted, and had a competition. Uh, uh, and they range from a video game of Beethoven, like throwing, you know, something at a waiter for some apocryphal story, to a visual kind of some sort of like a spectral, like visual realization of the concert that you heard that they can take away with them. An app that creates a visual kind of imaging of the sound that unfolds. So it was a really interesting variety of angles into what would make it better, and many. And then the third was a really lovely, elegant concert concierge app, you know, with the questions of what kind of music do you like. And it was one of the ones that these young you know, coders created, and were way better than ones I'd seen like in the New York Philharmonic. It was just very simple and streamlined and cool. So all of this is just to connect us to other people, you know. And orchestras are not islands, and I think collaboration is key. I think it's a, you know, the ivory tower is not a great idea for us going forward, but rather to be a part of, you know, the world of ideas. And, you know, I think, you know, there are a lot of people who are very curious, and our job is to you know, have them come in, you know, and kind of engage their curiosity
Yeah.
about a lot of things.
Yeah.
And, you know, hopefully they'll come back.
Yeah, I mean, what I love about uh, these projects, it's a way to really uh, look into the community, and have a dialogue with the community, in a sense, to have
Yeah.
a relationship, right? I think one
Yeah.
of my favorite projects at Cornell was we were planning the planets, and of course, one of my students in the base section, Laura, was an astronomy student, an astronomy grad student, and she sort of said, well, you know. Do you think you guys would play like to play for an astronomy conference with
Mhm.
1,600 astronomers coming to Cornell? And I said, what? Yeah, of course. So then I got in touch with Jim Bell, who's the astronomy professor here, and he was in part of the Mars rover project. And so then we had sort of had the scheme to have the projection while the orchestra plays, but the and it wouldn't be sort of your stock footage, but it would be actually made up of images and from the scientists who would be coming to the conference. So
Hmm.
and so, first of all, we had Bailey Hall, which seats 1,600 people, and it was completely sold out. And then, two, as each image went up, whoever was responsible or whatever team was responsible for that image let out a yelp because, hey, that's our image.
Yeah.
So, and that process of putting that the image show together was really heartening for us because, so first of all, Laura, who was in the astronomy grad department, she sort of cajoled together a whole bunch of graduate students and faculty to assemble the images. And but then the images were they had way too many for the show, but
Mm.
they were the ones who said, it's going by too fast, it's too distracting to the music. So we ended up having a show and sort of selecting maybe just 10% of the images and doing sort of a Ken Burns style slow pan and
Yeah.
slow zoom so that the music would really have room to be expressive and be heard over the images. So it was sort of a really great to see astronomers being sensitive to music.
Yeah. That's really interesting because, as you know, there are probably in the world right now at least 25 or 30, astronomical images with the planets,
Right, right,
floating around out there. There are several competing versions.
yeah,
So the idea in itself is not particularly original.
right,
However,
right,
the way you did it is super original because you're engaging with actual people and putting their, creating a conversation,
right, right,
between the two worlds and giving them ownership of it in a way that these other projects with the planets don't. And also, like you said, the editing. So that kind of that kind of conversation to me puts a collaborative project in the interesting category
right.
rather than you know you know all these concepts are easy that I've done, like music and food, music
Mhm.
and yoga. I mean, it's just a question of how well you do them and
Right.
what the real payoff is. And I think that when you guys are creating these projects, that's really the interesting thing. The idea itself doesn't have to be crazy. It could be a very basic idea, but
Mhm.
it's in the details and in the the goal of what's the end result of doing this.
Mhm.
Should it be cool, or are we really making contact with another
Right.
discipline in a legit way, or are we really leaving the audience with a very specific feeling that is special and wondrous, or are we just doing combining two things and then just leaving it,
Mhm. Mhm.
so it's the idea can be very simple, and it could be have been done before, as is the case of this planet's idea.
Mhm. So one of the things, as I was kind of researching for today, one of the things I noticed was that uh, it seems like you don't really do normal in terms of classical music orchestra setting.
Hmm.
I mean, I'm just gonna just quickly list things, and you can pick and choose which one to talk about. So, for
Oh,
example, you've done collaborations with not only composers like Nico and Carolyn Shaw, but Metallica. So I'm so curious to hear about how that happened and what that was like. Um,
hmm.
and then, and of course, you're the person who premiered "The Composer Is Dead" by Nathaniel Stewart,
Yeah.
which is a great family concert sort of piece. First time I saw that was I was up in Cabrillo, and the Cabrillo
Oh,
Orchestra
wow.
did that. Um, so, when you think about the orchestra and programming for orchestra, um, you know, we have the old sort of overture concerto symphony model, right? That's been handed down to us for a long time, and I think that has a way of really um, pushing people away because in some ways it's so restrictive. But what I love about how you have thought about uh, a way to reimagine the orchestra programming is that it goes to drawing in people who might not otherwise come to a orchestra hall concert. Um, so there are two questions. One is, uh, so there's that old idea of like the Boston Pops audience doesn't come over to the Boston Symphony, right? But I think there are certain problems of how they do it over there. But uh, can you comment on this idea of if you do a crazy project like with Metallica, will you see that audience in the next week's sort of more normal concert? And
I'm not sure. Um, and I'm going to be, this is a really interesting subject, and I have a kind of a different perspective on this. For instance, for me as an audience member, me personally, like I am perfectly happy, and in fact prefer almost going to see Riccardo Muti conduct Bruckner 2, you know, with the CSO, with no, I don't need any video, or I don't need any of that, you know. Because I'm a, you know, I live for that stuff, and like the old school stuff works very well for me. What I learned as a music director, and you know, just being, and especially during my time in San Francisco Symphony and other orchestras where I was assistant and sitting out in the audience 4 times a week for, you know, multiple weeks, is that I'm not most of my audience. Like my level of knowledge of the repertoire, I would say would be like, and kind of knowing all the recordings, all the conductors, like all this, you know, I was a super nerd about this. So I was like dubbing things, and, you know, even before stuff. So I was a deep diver into classical music. And so I realized that there are probably, you know, of that audience of 2,000 people, maybe 10 to 20% were thinking along those lines and interacting with music that way. It was not a large group of people. Many of them loved the experience of being in the orchestra. It was a refuge for them. They were curious about the music. I was a vast majority of them. They found it beautiful or soothing or dramatic, or they became fans of the people in the orchestra. There are lots of different interactions and iterations of what an audience member does. And so for me, the simple factor is I want them to remember the experience. You know, so the best experiences for me and an audience member, and they could have been in a very basic, it could have been, you know, when I was in high school hearing the Emerson String Quartet play Beethoven Opus 132, I remember that like it was yesterday. And there are other things like when I saw Star Wars for the first time, I remember that as a kid, you know, in the theater, or Raiders, or some of these great movies or things. So what is the quality of that experience that sticks with you, you know, when you walk away? And how can I help to create that? So I'm less concerned about crossover, because I think the orchestra has 2 concurrent jobs and possibilities, like an orchestra institution. One is to uphold the tradition of classical music through live performance that is 1,400 years old or so, to keep playing this great music live and connecting people to it live. That could be unadorned and just, you know, in the traditional way, or it could be with some extra information or education, or, you know, ins to the music that we could provide. The other concurrent kind of job, which is less understood in orchestras, and this is something I even heard at age 16. I was in a seminar with Ernest Fleischmann, who is the visionary executive director of the Los Angeles Philharmonic. He said, well, if you look at an orchestra, it's a community of musicians, and we don't have to be 100 people all the time. We could be 8 people or 20 people, or we could play, you know, and also if you look at orchestra musicians now, they play Beethoven, but they also have to play film scores, they have to play rock and roll, they have to play lots of stuff. And they are only taught classical, you know, generally in conservatory. And often that training allows them to play in these other genres where it wouldn't really work the other way around.
Right.
So the fact that they can read notation and can kind of jump into these worlds better than, like, let's say, a guy who's in a rock band or a girl who's in a rock band who doesn't read, you know, and they can do it, but it would take much longer,
right?
You know, so just to learn how to do it, and the speed of learning the music is slower. The process is different, not worse or better, just different. So orchestras can jump into jazz, rock, blah, blah, blah. And so that's a cool thing to be able to do. And it doesn't have to be either or. I really like the idea of both and kind of as we go on, and maybe post-pandemic, like getting musicians to realize that they're both important. And in fact, the wish was always, the aspiration was always this crossover, that we can get, you know, the Metallica fans into the Beethoven concerts. I think that's a bad strategy. It's never worked. And I think some of them do. You know, many of those fans, I've picked up like thousands of Instagram followers who are Metallica fans, and they will text me and say, what classical piece should I listen to, or DM me, and I'm happy to share that. But that's not, you know, not that many compared to the millions out there. But they did hear an orchestra and they liked it better, and that's, you know, it's not a bad thing. But I think the classical part of it, you know, these orchestras like San Francisco Symphony or Chicago Symphony who do these subscription concerts every week without really, you know, and that's the preserving the tradition part, need to rethink how they present that music
Mhm.
to get more curious people in there,
Mhm.
because that's the part that's languishing, and that's the part that everyone's afraid to touch, or you know, because it's an altar of holy, it's a sacred space, you know. And I wonder if it's serving us, you know, to play 4 concerts a week of the same program with no background or no information, and think that that's going to sustain us as we see the audiences decline, you know, because of that.
Mhm.
The problems with that are, first of all, it becomes another day at the office for the musicians. So if an audience is in the audience and they feel the orchestra phoning it in, they won't remember it,
Mhm.
you know. And it's pretty, even if you don't have music, uh, you know, and it's really hard. If you're in the San Francisco Symphony, you play your best every week, but maybe 2 or 3 concerts a year will be extraordinary. You
Mhm.
know, some will be pretty good, some will be terrible, and they'll be angry. You know,
Mhm.
and audiences sense all of that, right?
Yeah.
They sense when an orchestra's on fire, and you know, just like anything else. So we have to find, and it's also the reason I do a lot of these things is the musicians themselves are just, they can be just tired or bored just having to do this the same, just the repetition of doing it, even though the music's great.
Mhm.
um, we want to give them something to be interested in too, and that can be from the podium, great conducting, great interpretation, but also putting them in a situation, you know, where they kind of are out of their routine. So there are ways to do it, but it's a really complicated question, and I think the approach is often wrong. Um, and like this week I'm doing crazy music, it was Metallica last week, it's, you know, I'm doing Haydn military with Chicago Symphony in 2 weeks, a very standard program. It's all good, but it's how do we present it, and how do we, you know, how do we make it special, and how do we make people remember? That's it, you
Yeah.
know.
I think one of the things that, so I was lucky when I was a kid growing up in New Jersey. One of my best friend's parents, they were violinists in the New York Philharmonic, and I remember that the you know every workplace has uh, problems, right? So, but what I learned as a young person listening to two members of the New York Philharmonic talk about their workplace was that okay? Rule number one: never ever work for the New York Philharmonic because the
Yeah,
way they were complaining about the daily sort of happenings at work was such that uh, obviously something was not being done right. Where whether it was just same thing every day, so where you're just clocking in the hours, or whether it be whatever the problem was. But I think what you're talking about is really important. That you know it is really difficult for professional musicians in an orchestra to be inspired every day at work. I mean that's just humanly impossible. But I think that's the audience in a way wants that experience, wants that that orchestra to be on fire, and they want to see that musicians are inspired on stage. But it's really hard to do that day in day out if you're doing the same kind of program all through the season. So I think this, just for sake of a wider variety of context of how we present music, is in fact really imperative for professional musicians, so that sometimes they have a chance to play chamber music, sometimes they have a chance to play a Mahler or Bruckner symphony, sometimes they have a chance to play really fun Nathaniel Stuckey family concert. So I think this is a very complicated issue. You're right, absolutely right.
and I don't mean to denigrate the musicians at all. They're
Right.
actually really hardworking, inspired, dedicated people. They're not jerks. They're not. None of that is true. But orchestras can be tough and bitter and like that. And I think it's just, I think the workload is just to, you know, and it's the idea that that orchestras are putting out this product every week,
Mhm.
you know. Why? And the advantage is they get to play concerts every week, they get paid well, they could make a career by doing this, so that's good.
Mhm.
But you know, when it's Beethoven 9 first week, Brahms 2 the second week, Ein Heldenleben the next week, La Mer, somehow, you know, psychologically it takes the sheen off those pieces,
Yeah.
because they just keep okay. And so when, you know, my friend in the Chicago Symphony says, if I never play Tchaikovsky Fifth Symphony again, you know, I'll be perfectly happy, like, you know, it's sad, but I can understand, as
Yeah.
a human being,
Yeah.
where it's coming from.
Right.
Even if the greatest conductor in the world with the greatest orchestra, it becomes all the same, and it's because the music is presented that way, and
Mhm.
partly for good reasons, to create a living for the musicians,
Mhm.
and to create this steady stream of music in the community. But I think there will be a reckoning, for doing that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and it's being exacerbated by the pandemic and all sorts of things. And it's more just a structural thing. When you make these decisions, they have consequences. And, or when things evolve a certain way, they can only go so far. And I don't know if it's good or bad or what it is, but it's coming closer, I think.
Mhm. So the topic of the word pandemic came up. So I'm going to switch gears to talking about how you are responding to the pandemic, um, how things have changed for you in terms of thinking about the orchestra, how you think about programming for the orchestra, how you think about guiding students who are stepping into this really scary prospect of venturing into a career as a professional musician. Can you talk to us about how the
Yeah.
pandemic has affected the orchestras you have worked with and your students, and how you're thinking about orchestra?
I mean, it affected me uh, by having all my concerts canceled for the next year. And that was pretty crazy, emotionally, the grieving process, also an optimistic, well, okay, now I have a pause in my life. I'm not flying every week somewhere else. And how can I take advantage of this? Um, I think, well, my biggest fear of the pandemic is that we go back to doing what we were doing before,
Mm.
the same way, and not, just retrench and don't take this opportunity to learn and think about what we could do better. That's my biggest fear, actually. Uh, and it's quite possible, because I think these large institutions are conservative by nature,
Mhm.
and they'll find a way to survive and come back, and then they'll have other problems later on. Whereas uh, maybe there's a better way to think about it and come back, and people will be ready to come back, and that is a point often at the beginning of something, or to guide people in a different way and to
Mhm.
think about it differently. So I'm thinking a lot about that. And for me, one of the advantages of being in a conservatory, which is why I chose to, be a part of an institution like this, is it's not marketing driven, and it's a lab in a certain way that I have a responsibility to the students to get them jobs and make them great musicians, and that's really important. That's the most important thing, actually. But it's also, I can have a vision of what I want music to be
Mhm.
in a conservatory, and share that with them. And people can like it or not, or there can be a conversation about it. But the fear factor is not as big in a conservatory, because we're not as concerned about selling tickets or audiences. Um, but sometimes the best work, experimentation is done in a laboratory,
Mhm.
not in a commercial space all the time. Or, there's a mix. It's easier to do it that way. No one's telling me we have to do another Rachmaninoff piano concerto, or else no one will show up to our audience, is what you hear as a music director all the time. And so I'm excited about that, and presenting a vision of the future is really important to me, kind of along the lines of what I was talking about: creating films, exploring different repertoire. Uh, uh, right now in California, we can't have winds and brass in the room with us. Um, so we have this amazing thing called the Dante system, which is a no latency audio connection. So when we rehearse these ensembles, actually an oboe is in a separate room by herself. Oboe 1, Oboe 2 is in another room, and we're all connected by a closed circuit camera and through speakers and headphones. And actually, it works like extraordinarily well, because we can play together in up to 20 different rooms. So the strings would be with me on stage, and other people would be, elsewhere.
Mhm.
So that itself is teaching the students something. If you're in a room by yourself, you can't ride the wave of the stage, and you have to have stronger internal rhythm, better ear, you're listening differently. And so it turned out to be like a pedagogically very effective exercise, which I had hoped would be the case, and it turned out to be even more than I thought. But that's what I'm asking the students is, what do you want music to be like when you go out there?
Mm.
again, instead of like, I want to join the Chicago Symphony, or I want to join the San Francisco Symphony, or I want to be a composer, which is a nice idea, but like, what exactly do you want going forward? This is your world. There are a lot of people who are leaders, as people live longer, there are still a lot of people who are 80 years old who are still running things, which wasn't the case before. But, but I think it's really important to think that. And what do you want to be different? Like, that's what I'm asking over and over again.
Mhm.
Just the idea of representation in orchestras was something I always was aware of, but it really hit home to a lot of us during this.
Mhm.
And I'm interested in that a lot as well. And that's also visioning. I had an English teacher who told me, the reason I read books is I want to hear someone's story other than my own.
Yeah.
I want to live someone else's life or experience. And I don't think we do that in classical music that much. We live a canon that's very specific, but the idea of creating different stories and different narratives that are interesting on the stage where people are really concentrating and really listening and really engaging is a very compelling idea to me. And it's what I'm thinking the most about these days is how do we do this, things of real quality and start telling different stories on stage, and not pedantically or politically, but just having more narratives going on, musical narratives going on than we have in the past. I mean, we have a lot of work to do on that. And it's not, there's so many interesting composers out there right now who do have different stories and different narratives. And in the past, there are quite a few people who have been neglected, who I used to think, if we've heard it, if we haven't heard it, it probably was okay and kind of faded into but I don't really think that anymore. I think maybe 200 years ago that was the case, but I think throughout the 20th century, there's still a lot of wonderful music that is hidden or neglected that we can pull out and share. And so there's some exploring to do. But I'm thinking a lot about that.
Yeah, I once this summer we had a lot of conversation with the Cornell Orchestra members where at first it started by having a conversation about what makes a community that's healthy. So we started talking about the ability to listen to each other, the ability to be empathetic to one another. And then the Black Lives Matter exploded, and the students really wanted to create a Black Lives Matter statement. So I kind of nudged them a little further by saying, well, it's great, but if it doesn't really make a change in the way we do business in terms of our repertoire, how we engage with our community, how we recruit members, then it's just going to be an empty statement. So lots of conversations, and that led to us creating a speaker series where we had Carlos Simon and Jesse Montgomery and Daniel Bernard Romain as composers. We got to meet Aaron Flagg and Aaron Dworkin of the Sphinx Foundation. So we've had a really great conversations. But I think this Daniel kind of described it as we're in sort of this nexus point where there's this problem that's been here, but nobody's ever talked about it. Nobody's ever been willing to bring it up to the surface. But now all of a sudden, many orchestras and many leaders in the field are aware of it and wanting to talk about it and wanting to do something about it. So I think if anything that came out of this pandemic, rather than sort of retrenching and sort of orchestras saying, well, this is an emergency situation, we really can't be experimental or exploring unknown composers. I think many orchestras are finding ways to be more broad in their viewpoint and bringing in more voices. Yeah.
That's what I'm hoping.
Yeah. And I would love for you to talk about the commissioning project at the San Francisco Conservatory.
San Francisco Conservatory has a funny way. The president is a very dynamic person, David Stoll, and he does things. What I'm learning in the opposite of almost every other large institution, which I kind of like. So if you make if X orchestra makes a decision, it takes like 40 weeks, of committee and focus groups and this and this and this. And David is very different. he's make the splash first and ask questions later. And so a lot of these things are happening. Like he bought the biggest management company in the U.S. Last week, and you know, the commissioning project was very interesting. That the conservatory put out a statement around Black Lives Matter that was okay, but not great. It wasn't. I wouldn't go so far to say it was tone deaf, but it wasn't as clear and effective as it could have been. And there was a very considered and collaborative response from the Black students at SFCM. Like, this is how we reacted to this. Can we do something better? You know, and it wasn't brutal or tough. It was just like, let's have a conversation about this, which I thought was it was terrific. You know, a terrific response from the Black students at SFCM. And I think David was taken aback. Like, he learned from that. Like, oh wow, maybe this isn't the right way to do this. And in his own inimitable style, he went out in 2 weeks and raised $1.5 million for Black students at SFCM, which includes, you know, eventually 5 full scholarships in perpetuity. And the Composers Initiative that he put together is commissioning one young Black composer every year for 10 years. And having them work with me, Esapeka Salonen and Michael Morgan, who's a terrific conductor at the Oakland Symphony, mentoring and creating a pipeline, hopefully, that will be permanent and beneficial. And, you know, a large panel of people who will evaluate this music. And I'm excited about it. You know, I'm really excited about, and what does it do? Maybe it shows up, you know, and I've seen this at New World Symphony over the years. I go there every year in Miami, and the membership of New World Symphony has become more diverse in the last 5 years or so. And it's really changed the orchestra. Like, you can feel just people are coming from different places and different backgrounds, or from Latin America, or, you know, and there's just a different energy in the orchestra, just because there's a bigger variety of experience, I think, among the people. It makes sense. And I asked John Keyser, who's the provost there, how did you do that? You know, he's like, well, we went out and let people know that they're welcome. So through connections and Sphinx. And I think if SFCM starts to do that as well, that this is a place where, you know, we really do care, and we put our money where our mouth is, and we will engage with this change, you know, in a sincere and you know, profound way, that will help, you know, create a more you know, have many more musical narratives among the students going on than we have had, you know, or we'll have more. I mean, that's my hope, that what will come out of this for the institution, and obviously we're doing something pretty substantial, you know, on the other end.
Yeah. So, okay. I meant to open this up sooner to the students and our guests. And so everybody put your videos on, and this is your chance to put, either use your raise your hand function or put your question in the chat. And you're welcome to ask our guest conductor questions you might have about the field, the profession, Boulanger.
Oh no. Is this in chat?
Okay, Rehan.
I had a couple of questions, but I guess I'll let everyone go. I had one though. So you said you work at a conservatory, right? Currently?
Yeah. I do now. Yes.
Yeah. So my question was, do you think there's like a stigma around like American conservatories? Because like I was in Mumbai for a bit, and over there they prefer sending people to Europe. So I study in Manchester, but same moms always said, oh, you know, you should go to like Vienna or like to Germany. And my teacher has not looked down, but has always preferred the European like way of teaching classical music and the mentality they have. So I was just wondering, is there like
That's a good question. Yeah. That's a good question. The culture is different, I think. You know, when I work in Europe, there's more of there is more of a, do the excerpts, get it done, be the most efficient. There's a certain Americanism, that I see, which actually, in some sense, this kind of engineer-like efficiency in a lot of the playings, especially brass playing, for instance, like they can make the most sound with the least amount of effort. And there's this almost scientific, vibe to music that I see. Whereas it's a little looser in Europe in a certain sense, and more, the expression is more integrated into the technique sometimes. That being said, if you put a great American musician and a great European musician back to back, it just depends on who the musician is. And I'm drawn to Europe because it's just something I don't know as well. Is it better? Is it not? I'm not convinced one is better than the other. I think in Japan, for instance, where I conduct frequently, they love the European tradition and European things, but they're like, okay, if we're playing German music, we should learn from the Germans. If we're playing American music, let's bring Edwin and he can tell us how to do Gershwin. And I find that maybe a good shorthand. I also find it vaguely racist and, not, it's small thinking. So, I don't really, I kind of roll my eyes when I hear that, but I think at the same time, there are differences and there are different ways of teaching. So, we play other, and there is actually, German orchestras don't swing like American orchestras. American orchestras don't waltz like Viennese orchestras. And there are these kind of ingrained traditions of culture in these institutions that are serious and they're profound and they're real. They're not fake. Those do exist. And I remember going to Japan doing Porgy and Bess, and they approached it like really harsh sound. Like Bess using My Woman. It's like for some reason they thought like play blues ugly, which I never really got. And I said, guys, play this like Puccini. And all of a sudden it sounded like Gershwin to me. And I remember one Japanese musician coming out and saying, Maestro, summertime, the living is easy. Why is the song so sad? And it was a really sincere question. And I said, have you ever been out in Tokyo in the summer when it's really, really hot? Now imagine like picking cotton all day and see how happy you are in the summer. And so, oh, okay. So there are these cultural differences that are real and I'd love to see more interaction, but I think there's like a European, to cross the pond and to jump around to these worlds and to live, for me to go to Japan or Britain, or like not many of us get to do that. And I wish more people did, because I think I'm always excited to go to another country because I'm just going to absorb all that culture that I don't know about or I haven't experienced, and hopefully in the same way share with others. So it's always exciting. I wish there were more cross-cultural stuff. We would get more out of it.
Oh, thank you so much.
Okay, Peter had a hand raised, then Alec, and then Pierre. So Peter, you go first.
Awesome. I was this is kind of hopefully a fun question, but I was just wondering, what do you feel is the greatest like in the moment mistake you've made in your professional career? And then like, what did you do to just work through it?
God, that's a really interesting question. I like that. What I didn't understand as a young musician is that even though I felt something very profoundly and had thought about it and studied it, it took me a while to learn to communicate it to a large group of people. So for me, I'm kind of an introvert by nature. And many musicians, as splashes there on stage, are introverts, which is kind of a funny thing. Like Michael Tilson Thomas is a complete introvert, even though he's a great communicator. And so what I didn't understand is that, and this was specifically about conducting, is that to get to people, like what I had to do, how I had to open myself up and to share actually emotional things, not telling a sad story on stage, but somehow finding that moment where what I'm doing and what I'm thinking, I can tell people are really understanding it. And I think I see that with young musicians all the time. And it's like, do more, do more, do more, do more, like get across the foot. And that was a long journey for me, I think. But I really had to evaluate, and the way I got out of it, Peter, which is the interesting part, is being really honest with myself. Like, okay, this is not working. Why is it not working? Um, what is it? Do I have to go to like, at one point I even went to like a performance coach, to help like connect cerebral to like, I did lots of crazy things just to make it work. Yoga made me more body aware, than I was before. And now I move very fluidly and kind of have connections physically and mentally that I didn't have before I did that. So it's not just working harder at the same thing. It's sometimes being brave enough to go off in a really different direction and see if you get anything out of it. If you hit a wall, and if you're a musician, you will hit so many walls if you're trying to get better. And also knowing that, music is, when you get better at music, it can be flat for a long time, and then you can jump up and all of a sudden that's kind of how your body and your nerves learn things, and being patient with that. But yeah, it's really, when you hit a wall, like really thinking about every possible way to get through it or get around it or get over it, and I was really glad that I had the courage to look at myself and my weaknesses and my gaps and try to be clever about how to do it. And I became a better person, actually. Or, it was not just being a better musician, but I learned a lot about myself that way, which is ultimately the great journey of music, that it puts these challenges up in front of you that are quite frustrating.
All right, Alec is next, and then Pierre, and then EJ.
I was curious about hearing more about what difficulties you faced entering a music career, where like traditionally we think of that as being like, the only way to do music is that you start high school and you like focus on training, getting into a conservatory, and then you do a conservatory, and then, right, you came into it from a different path. And I'm curious about what difficulties you faced because of that path.
Mm-hmm. I definitely had to work on my conducting. My teacher was kind of a wacky teacher. And so he had a very aggressive technique, which I still use. And then I went to a teacher called Daniel Lewis, who was kind of like a Larry Radcliffe type person that, he was at USC, passed away, who kind of refined, so what was acceptable to the music world and what I offered, I had to kind of find my way. It was winning auditions, right? Because really they don't care where you come from if you win the audition, and getting in there. And because I was a player, musicians would suggest me to audition for assistant conductor jobs. So people I knew already and were oh yeah, you should do that. So I always had an in, even though I came from the outside, because I was, playing at a certain level as a player. So I wonder, I'm not, and I think, I think it is possible, but I think that's one of the great things about classical music, is the proof is in the pudding, essentially. And it's, if you get up there and you do a good audition and you win the audition, you can move forward. I don't think being an outsider was an advantage or a disadvantage, particularly for me. It just was being ready for that moment when it came, if that makes sense. Yeah. I also really believe if you're trying to make it in music, whether you are in the conservatory system or not, making connections and building a network of people who support you, meaning established musicians, other friends, getting people to know about you. You actually have to put yourself out there. And I urge young conductors, all the time, like, go talk to people. If people want to talk to me, I talk to them. And I remember, if I have a conversation with someone, I remember who they are. And when the time comes, if I can help them, I'm certainly willing to help them. So I would talk to, at music festivals, I would sit down with Marin Alsop or, all these various people, and Bob Spano, and like, just, hey, can you help me? And they did offer help. And I think that was essential, actually, especially in a conductor or soloist career. You could be great, but, and it's not really self-promoting. It is in a way, but it's also just learning, and being brave enough to get out there and get to know people. And for me, since I wasn't in a conservatory environment, that was even more important. That's one difference, I would say, is like, I have to make sure I know, these people in music.
Okay, Pierre, and then EJ, and then Francis.
Thank you. Hello, I am now in Los Angeles and I teach in Malibu, California. So hello from SoCal. Thank you, Professor Kim, for allowing me.
I went to Samohi. So
no way. I live in Santa Monica.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing your perspectives on what you've observed from the New York Symphony and also SFCM's actions putting money where the mouth is. I'm wondering, do you have any suggestions for when we don't have a budget? What are alternatives, ways we can do it to, to lift up the underrepresented
Wow.
or to connect with the community?
I mean, what kind of institution are you working in?
I work in a liberal arts college,
In a
Pepperdine
college.
University. Mhm.
Oh, at Pepperdine, great. Well, everyone wants to go to Malibu. Pepperdine's like the most beautiful campus in the country. I spent a summer there once at a music festival. I think if there's no budget, that's a really good question, and it really is institution specific. What do you have to offer? I would say just starting like, so you have a beautiful campus, a beautiful experience, idyllic, and maybe, partnering with another institution in a less idyllic place, and creating some sort of traffic between those two places would be really interesting. I mean, if I know Pepperdine, it's just what strikes me about it is how gorgeous it is and how calm it is and how, and how could that be beneficial for people to visit it and see and experience that in the realm of music? So, are there churches in other parts of Los Angeles that, or other places, or Pepperdine is also a religious institution, and like, are there connections you can make with other similar institutions that are in less gorgeous areas, and can there be cross traffic, and can people learn from each other in this way? That would be like just off the top of my head, like one way, and that's no budget, that's just a partnership. And it doesn't have to change the world, it just has to. And when you're looking for those partners, sometimes the person with whom you most want to work just isn't interested. And sometimes some totally random person is super interested and you feel that chemistry with them. And then this can become a partnership. So I found that in collaboration, that's the rule of collaboration. You have to feel the energy of the collaboration, and don't be obsessed with getting something that you want if the other side is not interested. You have to find, move on, until you find the thing that's really working. And it's just, because two different people or two different institutions have to be in the same headspace for collaboration to work, and have the time also. And so I think that's my key thing for collaboration. But that would be a no budget way. Find somewhere, find a partnership somewhere else, totally different than Pepperdine, and that, or may have something in common, like, some sort of religious thing or whatever that, that's characteristic, or, whatever it is, and then start finding that partner and then start doing stuff. And if it's a good partnership, it will grow on its own without you forcing it, but it's finding that energy is the key thing. But yes, there are many times where like someone with whom I'm desperate to work is like, you can tell like and they always say they're interested, because let's do a musical partnership. Oh yeah, it sounds like a great idea. You'll always get that. And they are interested, but they may not have the bandwidth to actually do something, Yeah.
Whenever the Cornell orchestras have toured, we look for a collaborative partner so that it's a way for us to really save cost in the venue and instrument rental and local logistics. But it's absolutely true. If you have a partner that's willing, and your chemistries match and your agendas match, then it can be really a win-win for both groups. But if the other part's not interested, then no matter how you want to do it, it won't work.
That's why I felt the energy of the physics partnership, and it turned out to be the best partnership. Not because I had a plan or had any idea how the thing would turn out. I had no idea. I was like, oh my God, I'm sitting around, it was like the craziest start. It's like, I don't know anything about quantum physics. I mean, but the personal energy was there.
Yeah.
It's unexpected. That's the fun of it, actually.
EJ, and then Francis.
Okay. So like I remember today you've been talking about like how creative programming can be done through intersections, and you've talked about like so many intersections you've done. But like you also talked about the importance of the traditional repertoire. So I'd like to know, like, how do you make that kind of experience more engaging, perhaps like on a personal kind of view? Like, how do you personally like try to make it more engaging?
Yeah, with the musicians, I try to give them background into the music. So if we're playing, like, just engage them on like the story of the music and why we're doing this. And I often tell them, if they consider it, this is why we're playing this piece. This is why I'm not, it's not a secret. Like, this is what I want you to get out of this experience. And some students will go down the rabbit hole, some won't, but that's fine. That's the way it works. With the classical music world, I think in a main series concert, that was really my agenda. Uh, is creating a sense of unexpectedness and wonder. So as I mentioned before, the brain's a pattern detector, and so you want to throw people off of their patterns. That could be a combination of pieces, doing a bunch of short pieces in a program. It could be narration, background, images, like anything. And so my rule is to throw people off of their rhythm and to get them in a place to be in an unexpected position and be surprised by what they're experiencing. And I try to avoid at all costs for it to feel like I'm explaining anything to them and being pedantic, you know? So I try to, like, my kind of rule is like, well, a concert should be like walking into a fun house or a haunted house or some, you know, or to a movie theater where you have no idea what you're, you know, that you're like, wow, you know, it's more of an instinct than a formula, you know what I mean? And even if I have a very, quote, you know, not that interesting, a standard concert is like, how can I just make it not the usual? So I'm always trying to get off of that. And depending on the situation, I can get away with it most of the time. In San Francisco, we have a thing called Soundbox at the Symphony, which is a completely multimedia. You walk in, you don't know what is being played. You don't know, there are video screens, there are multiple stages. And I've told stories about, like, I kind of theme every concert when I've done 5 of them. Some of them are about traveling the world. Some of them are about dreams. Some of them are about California and like psychedelia, you know, and crazy things like that. It just, you know, what kind of journey are we going on? And if it's over explained, it's probably not good. But it's more by instinct and feeling. How do I feel as an audience member? That's always my rule. Like, what is the audience getting out of it? It's a vague answer that I'm giving you, but it's kind of purposely vague. It's really from the gut with me and less from the brain, you know.
I think we have time for one more question from Francis.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for this talk. It's been so inspiring. My question, you had mentioned Porgy and Bess, and I guess it also is kind of Eve's question about just creating these creative connections and conversations with the community, but with the opera world. And I know a lot of stage directors are trying to do that with some crazy staging and, you know, putting operas in strange, you know, in a refrigerator or something.
Yeah,
but I
yeah,
guess coming from a music director standpoint, when you go in, do you have thoughts on how we can connect the music when, you know, you're involved with other opera team member production teams and things like that?
Yeah, I think opera is really interesting, right? Because it's opera is changing a lot right now, and I think there was you're kind of referring to someone like Yuval Sharon and some of these guys who are out there doing stuff, and I think, what does opera offer? I think, and opera can be intimidating for people because it's so long and it's such a big journey. I think I would like to see, I like that. I think Yuval is successful because he does do what I was just talking about. He brings people out of their comfort zone, and somehow being out of the comfort of the concert hall connects people to the music when it's successful in a really interesting way. And I think when you want to say, okay, why I want to share opera with more people, like the first question to ask is, what is special about opera? As opposed to art song or orchestra or Britney Spears, you know, like what is successful about it? And one thing I would think of off the top of the bat is that just the athleticism of the singing, how loud they have to sing. Like if you tell someone who doesn't know opera, these people are singing without microphones, it blows their mind, you know? So and the kind of training that goes into singing like that. So there are so many people who love Mariah Carey and Whitney Houston who could love opera singing, you know, but don't even know how it works, you know, that there's this love of big voices and big singing. So like, I would like get people close to an opera singer, you know, in a room and have their ears like, what, you know, what the hell? And like take them through the process. I think the process of opera is really hidden, actually. from people. They just see the glamour and the spectacle of it. But in fact, I would say, you know, the more interesting thing is like how it's coached, how voice training works, and how we can kind of do these subtle emotions in opera and sing like really and crazy loud. You know, like some of it's so sensitive, but really the sound production is so huge, and just the pure complexity of how an opera production works is pretty interesting to me. So that, like, that's just one idea, but I think just getting people close to. I remember I worked at New York City Ballet once, and I'm really not a dance person. I didn't really know much about dance, and I admired it and the beauty, you know, but wasn't something I was around a lot. And we were doing kind of piano conducting from the side. It's something you do before a Nutcracker, and seeing these principal dancers kind of come at me like spinning, and you know, just the physicality of being near these people made me understand it so much better. So that's something I you know, just randomly made me think about it. But that's I never see people experience that in opera.
So unfortunately, we're out of time. So if we could, I would love to take a group picture. So everybody say hi. I'll take three. Here's
Okay.
1, 2, 3. Edwin, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your insights and wisdom with us. I learned a lot, and it was really great to get to know you better and get to know of your work with the San Francisco Conservatory and all of your wonderful work you've been doing.
Yeah, well, it was really fun. Great questions, and good luck, everybody. Have fun doing it. Yeah.
And everybody, so I put up a couple a new assignment things in the course. So do the reflections. Okay. All right.